Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, good people. My name is Ravyn Miller, and I'm a Senior Marketing Director for Medtronic. It is my absolute honor to serve as the moderator for today's conversation, Clinical Trials from the Ground Up. This conversation is actually a continuation of a discussion that was hosted last year during the height of the COVID pandemic. It was focused on the need for diverse representation in clinical trials, knowing that disparities of care might actually pivot from what we're learning in these clinical trials. There was a lot of conversation that we had last year and a lot of solutions that we presented to our audience members. And so today, 1 year later, we're going to talk about what we've learned and how we continue to apply those lessons learned to other conditions that are facing our ethnic minority populations. And I have a fantastic group of experts that are going to be joining me here today. So in just a moment, I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves, and then we're going to break up our conversation into 3 sections. The first one is going to be setting the baseline for what we know about enrollment, ethnic enrollment in clinical trials today. Then we'll talk about some of the challenges that we have identified as it relates to enrolling ethnic minorities in clinical trials. And then finally, our favorite section and an audience favorite section is what can we do to move the needle forward? So with that, I'm going to now ask all of our panelists to introduce themselves. So they will state their name, their company, their title. They'll share one fun fact about themselves and then talk about why they gave their time here today. So with that, we are going to start with my friend, Racquel Bruton. Hand it over to you. We'll have you come off mute so everyone can hear you, my friend.
Good morning, and thank you, Ravyn, and thank you to the fellow panelists. My name is Racquel Bruton, and I am an Associate Director, Clinical Operations Lead at Biogen in Cambridge, Massachusetts. One fun fact about me, I've been a USA track and field official for over 20 years. Why I'm here today is because I love what I do, and it's important for me to be able to contribute to such an important and personal topic.
Thank you so much, my friend. All right, now we're going to turn it over to Alan Ryan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Ryan. I work for Novartis. I'm the head of external partnerships and medical engagements. And one fun fact about me is I'm a graduate of Howard University, as is my wife, and both of my children are graduates of Howard University. So we're, let's just say, bison strong here. And my connection to this topic is, frankly, I'd say bred in my family. I'm really one of the primary people in my family who helps to, shall we say, shepherd people towards trying to maintain their health. I'm sure a lot of people do that in their individual families here. So I'm very committed to health equity and appreciate being able to participate.
All right, thank you so much. Now we're going to turn it over to Racadio.
Hi, Ravyn, thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm Racquel Racadio, Senior Manager for Diversity and Representation in Clinical Research at Amgen, where I'm helping to lead a program fully dedicated to improving the proportional representation of historically excluded participants at Amgen's clinical trial programs. One fun fact, I'm a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, and I was a member of my college's women's a cappella group, which I like to tell people was just like the group from the movie Pitch Perfect, except not nearly as cool. But I can do a mean Britney Spears rendition if it's needed in an emergency. But for my current role, most of my clinical research career was focused on clinical trial operations, including feasibility and making clinical trial site selections where our clinical trials take place. But my background is also in public health research, with my work focused on health disparities, especially as they relate to American racial and ethnic minority populations, including my current dissertation work. So I've always been interested in the work of the National Minority Equality Forum does. And when I was presented with the chance to talk about what's both my passion and my real life work at this panel, I really jumped on it. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you so much, and thank you for being here. And then finally, we have Esther Raybrick, who's gonna share her story as well.
Hi, I am a clinical development manager at GSK. I work mostly in operations, and I oversee studies from beginning until the data is published. I'm a pharmacist by trade, and one of the fun facts to share about myself is that I talk to myself a lot. And my family thinks I'm crazy, particularly my kids. They beg me not to embarrass anybody by talking to myself. And I tell them, but there's a couple of reasons. One is that I'm an auditory learner. I learn through listening. So, and I have spent my whole life listening to people. And that's really how I learn. And then I repeat it and it sinks in. But the other thing is, I'm actually the only person who all of the time gives me the answer that I want to hear. So talking to myself keeps me very sane. And I try to tell that to my kids. The reason I'm here is I am a first generation Cuban American. And as I was growing up, I was trying to fit into two cultures. And I always felt disfranchised a little bit because I really didn't fit into either. And that fueled my passion for inclusion, diversity, and equity. At GSK, the opportunity came for me here through I volunteer in the group in clinical demographics and diversity at GSK, and I was thrilled to come here to really learn, share information, connect with people of like mind, so that we can really achieve the goal of increasing that the demographics in our clinical studies.
All right. So, thank you very much. So with that being said, I forgot to name my fun fact, and I am a self-proclaimed brunch queen. So I think between the five of us here on this call, if we all go to brunch, we would have a really good time. We just state that for free. So with that being said, I want to remind the audience that if you have questions throughout the conversation, please make sure that you type them in the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end. We've saved enough time to make sure that your voice is also heard. So with that being said, we're going to jump into the conversation at this point, and we're going to first just set some baseline so everybody can start from the same point. And so Racquel B, this first question is to you. Can you describe for the audience the different phases of clinical trial design and what stakeholders are involved in each of those phases?
Sure, it's a pleasure. So initially, when we talk about clinical phases, we'll first start off with preclinical. That's where the testing is done on animals or in a laboratory. You have to make sure that the compound that's being tested is safe to go into humans. So you would then move into phase 1, which is typically 20 to 100 people. It's usually healthy people and the people who have the disease. And the length of it is usually several months. They'll go into different dosing cohorts. The purpose of a phase 1 study is for safety and for the dosage. Now, about 70% of studies make it out of the phase 1 space into phase 2. When we look at phase 2, it's going to include about several hundred with the actual diagnosis, and it can go anywhere from several months to 2 years. The purpose there is for efficacy and to look for side effects. If the compound makes it out of the phase 2 space, which is about 33% of most studies, they will enter phase 3. Now, this is a large scale. This goes up from 300 to about 3,000. It's anywhere from 1 to 4 years. The purpose here is for efficacy and adverse event monitoring. So seeing how the drug is actually working in a larger population. This is when most drug companies will file for an approval for the drug, and about 25 to 30% make it through to phase 4. When you get into phase 4, that's several thousand that would have the diagnosis, and we're looking for safety and efficacy there. Since the topic here is building the trial from ground up at Biogen, we're making sure that patients who typically would have been considered for a phase 3 are entering the clinical trial space at a much earlier phase 1. You want to make sure that if these patients are going to be the ones that will take the drug, that they are making that they fit the dosage that's being determined in that phase. So the earlier, the better.
Thank you so much. And just for clarification, can you define for the audience what you mean by efficacy?
So yeah, so you want to make sure efficacy really is, does it work? Is the drug doing what it's targeted to do, what the researchers set out for it to do? Is it
Fantastic.
efficacious?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, my friend. So with that being said, we want to make sure that as we're building therapies and drugs and different devices for our patient audiences, we want to make sure that they're efficacious in all patient populations, including that of our ethnic minorities. But it's important for us to understand, Alan, what the current representation of ethnic minorities are in these clinical trials. So it'd be great to hear from you what your experience has been and how this potentially has changed over time.
So in 2019, the trials had 9% of African Americans in them, and we know that the US population is above 13% of African Americans. And also from 2007 to 2017, my understanding is that Hispanics should have been 3 times as many in clinical trials than were actually in the trials. So, frankly, the reason for this panel is because there's a need, obviously, for us to have more representation of Black and Brown communities in these clinical trials so that we can see how the drugs are working in those populations.
Completely agree. I mean, I remember we had this conversation last year, and there was a conversation around breast cancer and making sure that the clinical trials were representative. And there was one trial that looked at tamoxifen for breast cancer patients, and they initially said that it worked differently in Black patients versus white patients. But then when they did a sub-analysis of that, one of the biomarkers proved out that it was as impactful for Black breast cancer patients as it was white breast cancer patients. And so again, having that good ethnic enrollment will help us to define what's working in certain populations versus not. So I appreciate you chiming in your voice here. So Racquel, Racadio, maybe this gets at a question for you, which is why? Why is it important that we have good representation in all of these trials?
Sure. So thanks, Ravyn. I think that we've been talking about this, pretty much all of the summit so far, but there are really recognized differences in the incidence of disease among racial and ethnic groups, as well as differences in exposure and response to products across racial and ethnic groups. And a lot of people on the call might already know this, but diseases that disproportionately affect racial and ethnic minorities include things like diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, asthma, obesity, certain autoimmune diseases like lupus, infectious diseases, and cancers. We know that in males, incidence and death rates are higher among non-Hispanic Blacks and non-Hispanic whites for all cancers combined. And so the underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minority subjects in clinical research really contributes to the collection of incomplete or limited trial data, especially when you're talking about things like safety and efficacy, as Racquel had talked about a little bit earlier today, really leading to limited access to some of these innovative treatments, and then ultimately disparities in health outcomes is what we're talking about today. We also know that patients and investigators and sites have a lot of options regarding the research they choose to participate in, and they're becoming more and more aware of those options and the kinds of questions they should ask about research. Now, Amgen, we're interested in providing clinical trials as an option to the diverse population in general, as you asked, but we're really focused on the proportional representation of different groups as participants, which is important to talk about, because we really want our studies to mirror the disease states and experiences of people as they exist in the real world as much as possible. So for example, if a disease incidence is higher among Black males than the rest of the population, we should expect that a clinical trial participant population should mirror that as closely as we can.
And fantastic. And I completely agree. That proportion piece is going to be so important as we look at how do we actually become effective in understanding what therapies are going to work in different populations. So I appreciate that question. All right, so now I want to move to really getting deeper into some of the challenges. So, we look at what the CDC said earlier this month, and they said that racism is now officially a public health crisis. Racism has now been defined as a public health crisis. And this has real impact as we talk about ethnic minority enrollment in these various clinical trials. And so, Esther, I want to bring you into the conversation, my friend. As we think about what we need to do, as it relates to helping more patients enroll in these clinical trials, it's complex. There are some complexities in trying to navigate this space. So can you help the audience understand what are some of the complexities that patients may face as they opt to enroll in these various clinical trials?
Yes, you are correct. Clinical trials are complex, even for those who have been trained and who have gone through a lot of schooling on this. The challenges, I think, are threefold. One is that the patient needs to understand the protocol. The second is that they need to understand their commitment, the time in the protocol. And the third, which I think is the most challenging, is that they have to navigate the logistics of their situation, whatever that may be, and that's different across all the ethnic diverse population that we have, navigate that to have access. On top of that, on top of those three things, the understanding of the protocol, the commitment to the time, the ability to get to the site and navigate, there is a trust issue that surrounds, much like COVID has surrounded everything we do. It's created a bubble around us. There is a trust issue, and that is different for different people. So, for instance, in terms of understanding the protocol, there are restrictions. Well, first of all, the criteria to enter the protocol has been up to now very unflexible. And by the way, there is a reason for this. There is a reason. It's just the nature of research. You want to minimize, you want to decrease any bias that you can possibly do when you present your data so that people can't challenge your results. And that's why it's so, the inclusion criteria is so heavy. In addition, there are lifestyle restrictions. Lifestyle restrictions affect different cultures in different ways. And on top of that, there's a whole medical terminology. Well, there's a language in two phases. One is your native language. Many of ethnic minorities have English is not their first language. And so they feel that they understand English, but honestly, the medical terminology is even not understood by people who have English as their second language. So there's that part. And then there's also, as I mentioned, some lifestyle restrictions, medication restrictions. When you participate in a clinical trial, you may be taking certain medications that you routinely take, and all of a sudden they say to you, well, you can't take a pain medication 3 days before your next visit. And there usually is a reason for that. If you're in a pain study and you're being assessed for pain, you don't want any interference from anything that's even, over the counter. So the protocol itself is complex. And then you have the time. These early studies, these oncology, which I'm in the oncology group, early studies are so heavy on procedures, are so heavy on the time that you need to dedicate to go to the site. So you may have to figure out how you're going to have an overnight visit at the hospital, how your regular visit is 8 hours. For ethnically diverse patients, this is a real challenge. It's a real challenge from a lifestyle perspective. They may be the caregiver for an elderly patient. They may have children that they have to, and they don't have flexible jobs. They don't have a job where you can say, hey, I got to go to the doctor's today, and I'm going to be gone for 8 hours. So that means that clinical sites do the research, they have to be aware of this. They have to perhaps work weekends. They have to perhaps have childcare nearby so that these patients, can access the site. So there's a lot of things that are really make this difficult, especially for minorities. I think there's cultural differences that flow into this. There's the logistic component of having access to the sites, and there's a trust component. Many of the sites that offer research are not the community sites that these patients are used to seeing. And we have to acknowledge that bad things happen in the past and that there's a reason for that mistrust. We have to acknowledge that up front. We have to also talk about, when we talk about that, and I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but I'll come back, we also have to talk about that good things evolve from things that happened in the past. And now there are more safeguards to study, such as the informed consent process and independent review from other people outside of those in the typical research. But all of these things really contribute to the complexities. And if I have forgotten something, please feel free to ask me, because I'd be happy to dwell on it.
No, that was fantastic, and I think it was comprehensive, and I appreciate you really giving us some insight to what this means from a patient lens. I think that's super important, because we think about practicing medicine and making sure that we create access. We always want to do it with the patient in mind, and so calling out those things that might be on the mind of the patient, or that might be culturally relevant to the patient, is going to be super important. So thank you, Esther, for your feedback there. But we also know that there might be barriers on the institution side as well that are driving low enrollment. And so I actually want to bring Racquel into this conversation, Racadio, and then when she finishes, Alan, I'd love to hear maybe your thoughts on this as well. So Racquel, from an institution perspective, what are some of the challenges that are driving barriers for enrollment?
Sure, Ravyn. So there's multiple institutions really at play here, including hospitals and clinics, pharma and device companies, insurance companies, and really the medical and research systems in general. And there's a lot of models that illustrate barriers to participation in clinical trials. And one that I've been going back to that really a lot is it buckets out key factors that contribute to disparities in clinical trials into three categories that all intersect. There's the individual level from the healthcare professional or the patient family point of view, the interpersonal level where there's the doctor-patient relationship or the percentage of each other, the perception of the institutional infrastructure itself, and then the system level, which is really where some of these institutions really come into play. And some of those categories that are under sort of the system level barriers include the availability of clinical trials, which Esther's touched on before, as well as strict eligibility criteria, infrastructure that even supports clinical trials within these institutions, whether things cost something to the patient, whether they have sort of the insurance coverage that can cover standard of care, and then lack of community engagement really on the part of institutions. We know that according to a really recent systematic analysis of cancer clinical trials just in the US, that nearly 75% of US-based cancer patients have been found to be unable to participate in a trial due to either study design or research location, with over half of them that were prevented due to just clinical and structural barriers, and another 20% who failed to meet eligibility criteria, mainly due to comorbidities with limited impact on their cancer outcome. So this really points directly to places where institutions are a part of the problem, but can also drive the solution, especially if you can remove system level barriers like these ones.
Thank you. Alan.
So the bottom line is, when you have an institution that's accustomed to doing business as usual, if they don't take intentional efforts, one size can't fit all, right? And I guess I'll say our natural tendency is to simplify and streamline. And so, and we've already had a lot of discussion here about how there has to be some intentionality, some extra thought given to diverse populations and how to reach and connect with those populations in order to build trust. And right. And so if that's lacking, if somehow there's not that extra effort that sometimes is required, or frankly is normally required to reach out to diverse audiences, then you're going to have, unfortunately, business as usual. So you have to have a little bit more focus there, in a nutshell.
Yeah, I had one physician that I work with out of St. John's who said, when you're trying to become culturally relevant, it's not just changing the words on a brochure. It's got to be much more than that. And that comes from building that relationship and that credibility with those different patient populations. And so, Alan, I appreciate you, and I appreciate you, Racquel, as well. And one of the other things we've also heard is talking about making sure that you have physicians who are representative of these different patient populations, just from an ethnic background as well. So maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. But for this next question, Racquel B, you are a heavy hitter in this space. You bring a lot of expertise. So I'd love to hear directly from you we've talked about a lot here. You've heard a lot from Esther. You've heard a lot from Racquel Racadio. You've heard a lot from Alan. If you were to say, all right, can't boil the ocean, we got to choose the top 3 priorities that we're going to focus on. What would be the top 3 priorities you would focus on and why?
Okay. Yeah, you're talking about the barriers, right? The top 3 barriers?
I am. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So what's interesting in my experience from running trials, diversity, inclusion, it's always thought of the US, but I run global trials and they're ethnic minorities in all countries. So when at Biogen, even for my own trial, we give the message that we want you to consider patient populations that normally don't come to your office, that you would liaise with other physicians that you know that may carry these patients, and encourage even European sites to think about who are the ethnic minorities in their countries. One of the first barriers that we noticed is that patients are just not being asked. These patient populations, they'll tell you, I was never told of the trial. So that is a number 1 barrier. They need to be asked. They need for the site staff not to make assumptions about them and their ability. Esther pointed it out about the time commitment, and so did Alan. Can you have some of the visits that may come on one particular day that's better for the patient? Our trials are designed where we have travel services and can arrange for patients to come and make that availability. The second thing is geography, and I think Alan hit to that point. We get in a rut. If I'm running a study and I know X number of sites will produce and give me the timelines that I need, I'm going to continually go back into them. So the vendors even that we work with, we challenge our vendors to find us new sites in the geographical areas, because we know that America, at least, is a racialized country. So it's not hard for people to go outside of their comfort zone and bring in the new investigators. Another thing is that it's not always a university center. While we may love to work with key opinion leaders, maybe patients, ethnic minorities don't go to these particular centers. So we have to train up new physicians, new clinical staffs to be able to bring in and be able to run a clinical trial effectively. The third barrier, I believe, is site comfortability. So sites are going to stay and be close to what they're comfortable doing. You will find that because site staff is not comfortable dealing with an ethnic group that they're not familiar with, that they will self-select. When challenged, they may assume that us as a sponsor want a typical type of patient. That's not it. We want the patients to decide whether or not this study fits, whether they can commit the time. And so I think those are the 3 barriers. It's not being asked, it's where the sites are located, and the sites being open to including patients that are typically not like their patient pool.
Listen, I think we just had church here. We appreciate your answer and thank you for your expertise. All right, so we are about to, family, move into the portion of the conversation that is always ranked the favorite, which is solutions. So with that, I do a costume change. So what we're gonna do is I'm switching from those glasses to some gold glasses, because we're about to set some new gold standards. All right, family, so let's do this. All right, so Alan, I'm gonna pose this question to you first. So listen, globally, we have experienced the pain of the COVID pandemic, but there were also some particular lessons that we were probably able to learn out of that. So really curious to hear from your perspective, how has our experience through COVID potentially forced us to think through how do we now create sustainable processes that will allow for us to enroll more ethnic minorities into clinical trials?
So I'll say one of the first lessons I think COVID has taught us is that, first of all, we're all tied together, right? That our health is all connected in some way, right? And we're all not well until most of us or all of us are in some level well. I would say COVID also has shown us that the impact of the disparities even impacts in short-term diseases where, you know, you have a widespread disease that frankly, you would say, well, why should there be a difference in how COVID is impacting different communities? And so I think it awakened in some communities, in some areas, I think it awakened that understanding that these disparities are real and should be addressed. And I think, frankly, if anything, that widespread awakening has created a greater, broader, deeper intentionality. And that's really, if I had to say, probably the one big lesson out of this would be there's going to be a greater, broader, deeper intentionality and focus by everyone on some level trying to do more, take an extra step to try to address some of the disparities and some of the practices and habits that we have that are, let's just say, I'll use the term streamlined and maybe oversimplified, right? So now we know we have to take additional steps to reach all communities so that we all can be well, and therefore we can all be well, right? So that's what comes to my mind when you raise that important question.
I appreciate that. You know, one of the other things I think about what Racquel B said earlier is around challenging assumptions. You know, Esther mentioned that there's complexity around clinical trial navigation, but Racquel also said that we can challenge assumptions. Perhaps if we don't use all of the complex language that we've been using before and we educate patients in the same way that we did with COVID. I mean, we broke that down and it was on the news very often. And so people got a chance to learn together. I think what that did was break down this barrier between providers and patients and academic centers, et cetera. And it gave us common language that we now can use. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to use some of that common language moving forward as we even think about the other clinical trials for different conditions. So with that being said, Esther, I want to bring you back into the conversation, my friend. And my question to you is this: how do we as industry partners who are funding a lot of these clinical trials and are working in concert with many of our providers, academic centers, et cetera, how do we build trust with the general public so that people feel comfortable enrolling in clinical trials?
Before I tackle that, I just want to add a comment to the COVID situation. I think one of the things that COVID also taught us is a sense of urgency. We had to do things so much differently than what we have in the past. We had to relax some of these processes that we normally do. I had to close out a study during time where you can't have the monitor go to the site. So we had to work a process around remote monitoring. And I am hopeful that we can carry this urgency as we move forward in our clinical studies. So to pivot now to the trust question, first of all, trust is earned. For some people, it is different, the speed at which you earn depending on your background and everything that you've gone through. So, but having said that, because of the things that have happened in the past, the mistrust is a legitimate concern. It's something, again, I mentioned that we need to address, and there are some good things that have happened. Industry, because we sort of do a lot and we understand a lot about clinical trials, needs to attack this at all levels. And the way I look at it is there's two components. There's education, and Alan, you mentioned intentionality. I just call it action, but there's education and then there's action. We need to do education. We need to do education and also learn ourselves, but we need to do education at the patient level, at the site level, and then at the industry level. At the patient level, we need to get patient voices into our protocol. At GSK, we have patient forums where we start with the science. So everything that we do really starts with the science. We look at the population that we're looking at. We gather a group of patients. We aim to have as a diverse group as we possibly have, and we talk about not only clinical trials but medicine in general, how they view the drug development, how they view the challenges, and we ask for their insight, and then we get back to them. So they may give us something that we cannot do. We have to let them know. Trust is really, again, it's part of communication too. So at the patient level, we get their voices. At the site level, some of these things were mentioned with our panelists here before. We need community outreach. The doctors that the ethnically diverse population sees are not these academic doctors at these academic centers. And because there's that issue of trust, honestly, from the background, they're not necessarily going to trust what I say, but they might trust somebody who looks like them, who speaks like them, who they have a relationship with at their community doctor. So we need to bridge that gap of the community doctors with the research people. We need to sort of help either have more community doctors learn about research, which is a complex and requires education, or have a referral system in place where they can refer those folks. And then at the industry level, we really need to take action. I mentioned GSK has patient forums. We also, and those patient forums provide an opportunity to get input into our protocols. But before we start studies, we actually have some plans in place now. We have a demographic plan. Basically, what that means is that we study whatever there is to know about the indication and where and what population has the most incidence of that. And then we look through where can we find those patients and how can we get those patients access. And that is built into what we call an asset plan, which the asset plan really encompasses that drug that we're studying across all studies. How, in general, are we going to aim for our diversity milestones that we set? And last, we have a study recruitment plan. And all of that, that's where you're going to get, where the feasibility is going to be done, which centers are going to have access. You use technology to find where the patients are. And it's all put into a plan that needs to be in place before a protocol is approved to move forward. We started this at later phase studies. You've heard about the different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We're now really trying to get this into that early phase. As it was mentioned earlier, that it really is important to study that patient when you're looking at how the drug is metabolized, what dosage is in that, in that early phase. These are things that it really takes action. It's a cultural shift among the industry because getting diverse patients in a study takes more time. And we are always tasked to do this as quickly as we possibly can. So by having these plans in place, it allows us to first have a plan and then learn from that plan and then create centers of excellence for diversity. So we know that, Center A and, Center B are patients that have delivered on diversity. So we tap into them. I really think it takes a village to develop a drug. And key is really education, community outreach, and really taking action through trainings and building processes in place that allow you to track and to measure your progress with this task.
Thank you, Esther. I appreciate you. All right, and I'm going to ask maybe one last question before we go into the audience Q&A. And so why don't we do a Racquel times 2, get both of your opinions on this one. People want to know, what are some tangible things that industry partners have done to step up the game and make sure that we have more enrollment of ethnic minorities in clinical trials? So we'll start with Racquel B, and then we'll go to Racquel Racadio.
Sure. So at Biogen, we've partnered with many community organizations, having patient panels speak directly to our protocol developers, ensuring that the assessments that we're asking in the protocols don't overburden the patient. If there's an ability to have this assessment done mobily, on a phone, on an iPad, versus having to come into the center, lose time away from work. We are constantly reviewing our protocols to try to decrease patient burden. But I did want to make a quick point. We do all of this work, but even at Biogen, the foundation of the work needs to be reviewed. So even as employees, in the folks that do how we do our work, our standard operating procedures, we have the other groups within our research and development looking at those processes to identify and to center these patients, to make sure that we're including them in our processes, that when we work with other departments within our group, it then becomes a more collaborative effort, so that it doesn't mean always patient and more time and more money, that it just becomes a normal part of the process.
Thank you for that. All right, Racquel Racadio.
Sure. So from a broader industry perspective, there's a lot of across industry initiatives, notably like Pharma, Transcelerate, CTTI, and Tufts, that are attempting to tackle this specific issue from a few different ways. And this is really critical, since there's a cross-industry collaboration to get us where we want to be as an industry more quickly and take advantage of all the expertise and passion that exists that we can share across organizations. Now, Amgen specifically is focused on embedding the principles of community-based participatory research, or CBPR, which is really well known among public health and community health advocates who may be on the call here today, but not necessarily in industry. So we're embedding these throughout our processes and policies because they really focus on including the patient and their caregivers and their community as leaders and partners throughout the clinical trial lifecycle. And that's really from evidence generation to data collection to study design to execution, all the way through to how data is shared back. And we know this takes a significant amount of internal organizational change, which Racquel, my named twin, already mentioned earlier. And Amgen's ready for that. We've already started, especially because the highest levels of our leadership are sponsoring the work, but it really relies on expanded and intense external collaboration with community organizations, faith-based networks, academic partners, including historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, and key opinion leaders who really have the pulse on what happens where the patients are, which is where Amgen plans to be, in order to develop really genuine relationships rather than transactional ones. Because we really think clinical trials should be designed with value and the convenience for the patient as a priority. And we think we're really on the right path to that.
Appreciate that. Maybe a couple other things I would add from an industry perspective. One is just transparency. So on the call that we had last year, it was a representative from Pfizer that mentioned that they want to be more transparent to the community. And so you could go to their website, and at any given point in time, you could see what the enrollment numbers were of different ethnic minorities. And that gave people more comfort and trust to know that they weren't being seen as guinea pigs, is a word that was used. Another piece I think that we've started to learn is that you need standardization of collection of this information. So as you're working with the different sites, having a requirement of including race and ethnic criteria as opposed to it being optional is another way that we can track and hold one another accountable to the new standards of what we're trying to do here. So again, thank you to all of our panelists for this great conversation. And now what we're going to go over is to the Q&A section. So for those that are on the call, just a reminder that if you have a question that you'd like to pose to our panels, please put it in the Q&A section, and then we will go from there. So I'll start off the first conversation with this. There was a question around making sure that we have community physicians and primary care physicians also engaged in this conversation. So from your perspective and from your expertise, maybe we have two people answer this question. How do we get more primary care physicians involved in these conversations and or involved in the participation with clinical trials? So any takers on that one?
I can take a stab at
Yeah,
that.
please.
My experience is that when with working at a large company, you're typically using a CRO or a vendor, and it's really us that have to drive the change with the vendor to tell them not to give us the same typical sites, that you have to go out and support sites that are new to research so that we can bring new sites in the geographical areas that we're looking for. And that takes some change, but it's well worth it. And it's really going to be us that's going to drive it. Because if I'm the vendor, I'm not going to give you a site that I know won't pretty much meet our contracted budget or guidelines. So that's one thing that we're doing, is to making sure that the vendors we work with are also on board with our mission.
And it gets back, from my perspective, it gets back at this whole idea of trust. We look at some of the patients and who they trust from a physician perspective. Many of it is the nurses that they work with and the PCPs that they've been going to for years. So
Yes.
if we can get to those people who have the
Right.
relationship already built with the patients,
Right.
get them aligned and understanding what it is that we are trying to accomplish, and make sure that people understand what the benefits are of clinical trial enrollment. I think maybe that's another way that we could look to partner with PCPs
Sure.
in this area.
And if you
Okay.
enroll the right patients, if you enroll the patients and include them earlier in the trial, then as a sponsor, we won't have to commit to post-marketing commitment studies because we didn't find them earlier in our
Yes,
trial design. So it's best, and I liked Esther's point, you have to go to the community investigators. It's not always the research centers.
that's right. Love it. And then I think there was, Esther, maybe you that talked a little bit about this earlier, but I want to build upon this based on a question that has come in, which is, how do you navigate this balance between speed and inclusion for enrollment in clinical trials? That seems to be a barrier that many of our companies and maybe some of the CROs are wrestling with. So how would you answer that? And if anyone else wants to jump in after that, please do.
I think this is something that, again, because we now have these processes in place that that start prior to protocol being approved, that recruitment plan for for that study is going to look at targets for where we're going to have, and we don't necessarily put them in the protocol. I mean, we've had discussions about actually including these targets in the protocol, but we put them in a plan of where, where we're going to have them. So it's something for us to work towards, and this gets approved by our management. So you have to have that leadership management approval in these recruitment plans. And you have to have that commitment to say to them, you know what, we may need to train the site. That may delay us in starting. But companies in general, I have found, focus so much on that first patient in, but really we need to focus on that last patient out. That's what's going to bring us the speed to be able to share our information and to be able. So to me, it's about being upfront and planning, having management approval. And as Rachel, you talked about, is really telling them the downside of not doing this, which is, we had a situation at GSK with Benlysta in lupus. We had to have all these post-marketing approval commitments because we didn't have the right population in our studies.
Right.
That took time. It took a lot of money afterwards. So I think we have to I always say it's a cultural change, and you need to start with planning and getting that stakeholder commitment that we're going to do it this way.
Love it. Thank you so much. Racquel
jump in
B, you
here.
look like you want to jump in here real quick.
No, I just to reiterate Esther's point, I try to steer the conversation away from, oh, it's gonna cost us more time, more money. When our industry had to include electronic data capture,
Mhm.
electronic medical records, that was time and money. Now it's not even a thought. And if we change the foundation in which we set up our trials, including these patients, will not only help us to include them, but give us more robust data so we know what this compound can do and how to react to it earlier. So it's just a benefit overall.
Mhm. Now, Racquel Racadio, you touched on this a little bit, but there's a question that's come in that I think maybe speaks to this, and you can help us amplify this a little bit more. And it was a question that said, is there something that we can do to bring all companies together to help discuss today's paradigm and agree on how we're going to move forward? So can you speak a little bit more about what that collaboration is, who's involved in it, and what you all are maybe prioritizing through that work?
Sure. So obviously panels and summits like this one already start that dialogue cross industry, which I think we have to keep doing, which the National Minority Quality Forum does really well. They've been doing it forever. So those things are really important. But now the industry as a whole is really turned towards this as a specific issue. I talked about some of those specific organizations like Pharma and Transcelery and CTTI. They're all looking at this from a few different ways. And those include things like data sharing, best practice sharing across sponsors, developing new ways of benchmarking where we are with disparities in clinical trial participation, as well as being able to measure that representation or underrepresentation more specifically and more surgically. A lot of these things are best practice sharing because I think a lot of us have been doing a lot of work sort of in silos or in bubbles. And there's so much work going on, so much passion, so much expertise that now these big organizations like Pharma, CTTI, Transcelery, they're bringing together industry sponsors who feel are in a space and in a structure where they can actually share that information more freely and are able to do so. Because we're able to do that across so many global sponsors, I really think it's going to move things forward a lot faster and make things a little bit more streamlined, as Ellen was talking about earlier, but also more uniform, so that at the end of the day, we're all talking to several patients, we're all talking to several different investigators, that we're really moving forward in a way that makes sense for everyone, but especially for patients as we work together to develop some of those solutions.
Appreciate that. And then maybe a related question is this. This is from our friend, Dr. Donnie John. How can non-traditional community-based organizations get engaged with companies around clinical trials? And how does this type of conversation get started? So for instance, if I'm thinking through this, is there an engagement that we can do with church communities or with sororities and fraternities, things of that sort? So would love to turn this over to the panelists to see non-traditional community organizations that we could work with.
Yeah, so I think Yale has their clinical research unit has an awesome model. They have cultural ambassadors, they have ministers, they have a patient, Hispanic, Latino patient organization. They come and review the protocols, and then they can disseminate to their particular community. Here's a study that's coming up. And I think from Yale having this cultural ambassador program, they were able to increase their ethnic minority participation in their trials at Yale, like substantially. So if more research centers could take on this model and link with the community centers that are in their area, they would get a better outcome.
All right. And then maybe one last question here as we start to wrap up here. And I thought this was an interesting one. And I'd love to actually have each of you answer this one because I think it's an important one. So as you think about where you sit in your seat within your organization, what has been helpful in engaging your leadership teams to commit to the types of changes that we're talking about here today? What has been helpful to engage your leadership teams to help them really drive some of the changes that we are talking about here today. So Racquel B, we'll start with you.
Yeah, quite honestly, at Biogen, what's been helpful is that I actually have the support of our executive and senior leadership. It's not just a one-time statement. It's funding that has been given to us. It's the putting it in our milestones and our objectives. And that helps me because it makes me feel like this is serious. This is not just lip service.
Fantastic. Let's go to Racadio.
Sure, thanks. I'd like to echo Racquel's thoughts on executive and senior leadership being really the sponsorship spine behind this because it trickles down to the rest of the organization. At the same time, our program started as a grassroots sort of organization within an employee research group, specifically Amgen's Black Employee Network, which helps because it has sort of that passion and that breadth of employees really supporting the work that we do. So it was important really to make a business case, a science case, and then also, of course, that social equity, social justice case all together, because that hits people at different points right within the organization and hits something within that's important to them. So looking at that from all different perspectives and putting it together to make a real case for what you're doing is also super helpful.
Fantastic. Alan, let's go to you next.
I'll just say, I'll build on what's been said. Our executive team actually has taken this on not just in words, but in actual, I'm going to call it day-to-day meetings, right? When you're doing actual planning and then actually asking the hard questions during, I'm going to call it our regular, ongoing, central activities. So it's not something that's off to the side as part of something special by itself activity. It's part of our ongoing fabric of our conversation to make this kind of outreach and health equity effort occur. So for us, it's a day-to-day thing, which is really very encouraging for me. So I don't have to, let's just say, be the sole champion of this. This is something that's coming down from the top, and I'm, let's just say, a participant in it, which is actually quite nice.
All right, and Esther, we'll go to you.
I ditto from me, from everything that's been said. It really starts from that executive level up. The clinical demographics and diversity team started with one person and many volunteers like me who felt passionate about this. In a year, it's built into a team of full-time employees that have championed these plans and things that we're doing at the protocol level. We've also created an engagement group that does that patient engagement. We're now looking into, I belong to another initiative, the inclusion and diversity within our oncology operations group. And our objective is to really look at how we can hire a more diverse workforce. We've talked about that, having people with the passion that look like us, that talk like us, is really important. So we're doing that. I also belong to the Science and STEM group, and that is a group that brings the love of STEM careers to middle and high school students. We really have to start that early on so that we prepare students. And we're now really focused on a few high schools in the inner Philadelphia school area. I just participated in some virtual career fairs in 2 last month, and it was very much appreciated. The teachers appreciated having something different to offer when these kids are in virtual learning. So we're tackling it not just from one perspective, but really expanding as we learn more about this, and so that it becomes a cultural shift, and that takes time.
Yeah,
that's what.
Yeah, would totally agree with that, and then maybe a couple other things. So I appreciate that. Medtronic, we also have kind of top-down support, but I understand that there might be some companies or representatives that don't necessarily have that. So maybe a couple of things. One is create a business case. So, you look at this 10 years ago, and what the business would tell us was that the browning of America, if you will, was going to happen in 2050. You look at that data now and it says the browning of America is going to happen by 2040, if not before. So the patient demographic that we're treating looks very different. The other thing that we did was we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just coming from us as internal champions. So we put together an advisory board of physicians and thought leaders where we ran some of these ideas past them. And there was also amplification from their perspective of how important it was to really address this need around addressing disparities of care by having more ethnic enrollment in your clinical trials. So it doesn't necessarily just have to come from you, but it can also come from thought leaders that are here in the industry as well. So I want to thank all of the panelists today for your time and sharing your expertise on this very important topic. I want to thank the audience members for their high engagement. We had far more questions in here than we could answer. We probably have 20 unanswered questions here. So I think there's potentially a part 2 for us to come back to and have this conversation again. But on behalf of the National Minority Quality Forum, I want to thank you all for giving your time, your expertise, and your energy here today. And thank you to all of our audience members for running this race towards equity and justice with us. You all have a fantastic day. Thank you for attending.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.